So you say that this concept of a shift to the left is a red herring, but what do you make of the continuing calls for nationalisation of the mines? Do you think this is realistic?
Well, it's clearly an unrealistic call, and it's an unrealistic call for several reasons. But let's place this call for nationalisation in where it comes from in its own political context. Of course, largely this call for nationalisation has come from the African National Congress Youth League. COSATU hasn't really said much about it. Of course, one of their affiliates would want to, and then you had one of its affiliates calling for the nationalization of the assets of two individuals, which the state clearly is not going to do because it goes against the grain of the constitution. It simply won't happen until there's a change in the constitution, so it really won't happen. The other thing about the constitution is that there is the protection of property rights. But the calls for nationalization, I suspect, seem to be a political strategy, and a political strategy which says let's ask for the damnedest so that we might get something slightly lesser. And that something lesser might in fact be the first prize, and that is the ability of the state to raise tax rates for corporates, which incidentally is not necessarily a bad thing, simply because in the context of this economic downturn, there's been a lesser amount of the tax take even amongst corporates, which typically was one of the largest contributors to the overall tax fund and the overall number of state resources which are available. And so while on the one hand you have to allow companies to be able to operate in as free and as low tax an environment as possible, given the kind of challenges we have overall on balance and within the context that we're in, it may in fact be prudent to raise tax rates by 1% or 2%, particularly for corporates, so that you do have a buffer in which the state can cushion some of the losses that it may suffer if it retains tax rates at the rate that they are. Of course, there was a cut in tax rate in last year's, in Trevor Manuel's last budget. So I think the overall effect on companies which are currently operating would not be as adverse as we might assume them to be, simply because the margins at which most of these companies are operating, they are not simply operating on the margin of either boom or bust, nor are they operating on the margin of literally just saving themselves or just surviving above the breadline. I think a 1% tax rate, increase in the tax rate, particularly for corporates, won't really affect those who claim to be affected by the economic downturn as adversely as they assume it might. I think that's the first point to make. The second is that we have all sorts of different frontier mentalities operating, particularly in the corporate sector. So you'll find that the Competition Commission is having to probe a whole lot of private sector suppliers. They also have to probe a whole range of retailers who've colluded in price fixing and so forth. But you find now that the state has suddenly cottoned on to the fact that in the mining industry you've had you've had fronting going on, in the sense that while operationally the mines still remained out of the control at management levels and at operational levels and it remained largely insulated from black control. At the equity level, there was the assumption that there was some kind of shift and some kind of transfer occurring. But even at that equity level, it seems as if this has been due to fronting rather than real and substantial equity and ownership changes occurring mines. So what happens in such a context, I think, when you have less than cogent behavior and less than faithful behavior to the spirit of the law or to the spirit of the codes and the mining charter which have been put in place, then you do create the burden on the state to try and create a regulatory system which they can in fact police. And there, I think, is where the real debate about nationalization will begin to either construct itself or fall, because it is ultimately a question of state capacity. When you have this kind of behavior, as I'm saying, you do create an incentive for the state to regulate to a greater extent. But the state, even though it realizes it has to regulate, sometimes realizes that it cannot confidently, it cannot coherently, and it cannot cogently police the kind of regulation that it puts in place. And it's found that's the case with fronting. They put up a policy in place, people found a way to go around the policy and defy the spirit. So comply with the letter, but defy the spirit of it. In that context, one would think that you would need better regulation and better policing. But the state, of course, shows that it doesn't really have the capacity to do so. And it showed, and this evidence is clear in a whole range of different public policy areas, whether it be local government because of the large number of protests, whether it be in saving jobs, whether it be in public administration or in curbing corruption, or in having efficient and effective public services. And Home Affairs is a perfect example of how this has not been possible. So realistically, to give the state ownership of mines through nationalization or a whole range of other things, a whole range of other areas of the economy, is unrealistic simply because the state doesn't either have the capacity, the know-how, the knowledge, and the operational nous of maintaining these entities as being profitable. So I think in that sense, it is really not really a call for nationalization. I think it's a call for nationalization in the sense that it's calling for the damnedest but expecting something much less, but the something less is in fact the first prize. And so I think it is a political strategy. That doesn't mean to say that one would question the bona fides, ideologically or otherwise, of those people who make calls for nationalization. But I think the prudent response, even from the ANC as a ruling party and many of its alliance partners, is that realistically this would not be possible simply because of the capacity constraints faced by the state. And the second is that the levels of accountability in areas of state control where the state already does have direct, not only influence, but also direct control, has shown that they've not been able to manage this as efficiently, effectively, cogently as possible. And the arms deal is one such example. The arms deal was supposedly meant to come with a whole range of industrial offsets, with large amounts of investment in different areas. And if we take just one example arising out of that, that's the Kucha development in the Eastern Cape. It appears that one of the private sector operators, Rio Tinto, who would have operated in that area, has opted not to go there because of a lack of reliable electricity supply. Now, when you give a state control over such economic decisions, as would have been the case, and was the case in this instance, and is shown not to be successful, the incentive and the motivation to take on more clearly is not in the public interest. It may be in certain, the interest of certain private clubs, cliques, and private interests within the ruling party, within the alliance, within the state, but clearly it's not in the public interest. And so I think the motivation for that kind of decision around large-scale nationalization won't really fly. It's imprudent, and I think the ANC and most of its alliance partners realize that. But it is a political strategy to get something much less.
You mentioned government capacity. Now, recent service delivery protests seem to indicate that government has inadequate management capacity. Do you think that the ANC may be wary of taking on more responsibility?
Well, I think there's no doubt that would be the case, which is why I think the call for nationalization, they would realize automatically, is in the short term at least an imprudent decision. And the evidence is quite clear that management ability, operational ability, not only those on the technical front, but in a democratic sense, relationships to citizens, accountability, responsiveness, have in many areas, whether it be local government or the Kucha example I spoke about earlier, not been as accountable, as responsive, as attuned to meeting the kind of development needs it was assumed that it would. Did not occur. And so in that context, of course, I think they would be wary, or should be wary. That would be the prudent response. But of course, you know, prudence is not always the hallmark of political decision making in all instances. And so something else might in fact in reality come to pass. But I think there are cooler heads which do prevail, and I think there is decision making capacity which is attuned to the kind of realities of what government can do and what government can't do. And until there are indicators that the ability of the state to manage contracts, the ability of the state and government functionaries to be more accountable, to be more responsible, and to be more transparent, and where anti-corruption measures begin to show that they are working, and particularly at local government level, that service delivery does begin to improve, the responsiveness of councillors and officials at the local level, that is the functionaries and bureaucrats in municipalities, become more accountable. And the same is true throughout the state management system, in the public service, in other public entities. Once that is shown to improve, then the appetite for taking on more might become a reality. But at the moment, I think not, because at the moment what government is doing in fine-tuning its ability, operationally and otherwise, in 4 different areas: the regulatory, the administrative, the ability to monitor and evaluate, in managing in human resources. So in all of those 4 areas, I think what's going on now is a process of finding out what went wrong, try and get those who are culpable and liable for having made gross mistakes, whether it be in service delivery or in the delivery of housing, to actually pay for it or pay some penalties for it. Then thirdly, to try and fix those areas. And then when there's improvements, not only after fixing things which may have gone wrong over the last decade, but improvements beyond fixing some of the symptomatic issues. Once that is evident, then I think the appetite for taking on more might increase. But I think government is in the phase now of identifying what the problems are, getting remedies to those problems, and then enhancing its own operational and management ability, both in a regulatory, administrative, technical sense, but also in the interface with citizens and the relationship between state functionaries and society generally and citizens.
What do you think needs to be done to get down to the real issues of governance and delivery, despite what some call all the noise around South Africa's economic policy questions?
Well, I mean, I think the first and most obvious thing is to move away from this unhelpful debate, which does seem to be taking airtime for no good reason, about, you know, the lurch to the left or the lurch to the right, firstly. And secondly, it's to get away from some of the unhelpful rhetoric which has emerged, particularly from some youth leaders, particularly to some elders in our society, and especially those who have a track record within the ANC itself. So that, of course, itself is not helping. So the tenor of the debate, of course, doesn't help, both in the sense in which we've constructed these bogies, which we now need to break down, and secondly, the immaturity, I think, of some of the political discourse which have been emanating. So I think that's the first thing we need to get out of the way. The second is that I think it's unhelpful for government and the ANC as a ruling party to respond overly sensitively to many of the critiques which have been made of the ANC's track record. And I think there is a greater appreciation, particularly since the new government. So this era of openness that we expected, I think, come to pass. So in that sense, there is a willing admission on many political functionaries, whether at the national level or at the provincial level, increasingly more political, elected political appointees of the ANC at provincial level, such as MECs, provincial MPs, and even provincial bureaucrats, people in the public service, have been willing to admit the kind of failures which have happened over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly in monitoring the kind of services which are delivered at local level. The audits, both in local government and in housing and human settlements, is some evidence of this, and it's a start. We don't know whether it will be seen to its completion, but I think the beginning of an admission is a process which is encouraging in the sense that it allows you to identify the problems and then find solutions to those problems. And I think more and more of these audits are going to occur simply because one of the problems is that there is no real adequate record keeping at local government level and at other levels of government, so that we don't really know what exists and what doesn't. The second is that beyond simple record keeping, there is no real system in place of supervision. There's no real system in place of monitoring, and there's no real system in place of evaluating the kind of delivery, the kind of contracts which have been entered into by government, and the kind of provision that those contractors that government has engaged, particularly in housing and other infrastructure projects, have delivered to the quality, the scope, the depth, and the extent that they should have. So those kind of monitoring, evaluation, and remedial actions, I think, is a great starting point at which the governance regime can begin to take a different turn. And I think politically it's encouraging that you can have political functionaries who are willing to admit this. What they're not willing to admit, however, and this is something for us to conclude, is that it is a repudiation, to a degree, of the kind of governance regime which was incepted under Mbeki. Now, Mbeki may have had some of the best intentions about what ought to have happened. Unfortunately, the instrumentalization was pretty poor. And so what really is, I think, conceptually going on now is the retainment of that kind of policy trajectory, which was determined under Mbeki, but the way of doing it is certainly taking a slightly different turn. There is a degree of greater openness. There is a greater degree of willingness to accept that some things have not worked ideally to the extent that they should have, and therefore those are being remedied. Now that itself is going to take some time to put in place, to develop the instruments of monitoring, to develop a mode and a modus operandi by which this should happen, then defining and deciding what the remedial actions should be, then contest, because some of these people might be contesting what those remedial actions decided are on, maybe. And so though that will take some time, but clearly this is an encouraging beginning. And in gathering the momentum for this to occur, we obviously need to let go of these bogeys about the shift to the left versus the shift to the right, about the immaturity of political discourse. And at the same time, it simply requires that those people who have certain functions to fulfill, whether in the state or otherwise, actually fulfill them diligently and faithfully. And it simply means that people who have a job to do must do the job.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa discussing calls for change in economic policy.